Take what not take. Took the belongings of a person who had just died, only to receive an extremely painful consequence. The woman who told this story was called Mina. She told me that in the past she worked at a job that sewed clothes as well as repaired clothes at home. Then next to her house there was a lady named Mrs. At that time. This Mrs. 8 was a single woman, no husband, no children. Mrs. 8 had to make a living every day by selling lottery tickets, as well as scavenging for scraps and scraps. When I saw that situation, I also loved Mrs. 8 very much, so I often came over to take care of her and give her food and drinks. Then that day, around 8 to 9 am, I was going to the market. From my house, to get to the market, there was an intersection. At that time, when I went like that, I saw that it was right at the very intersection. There were a lot of people gathered around, so I was curious and wondered. I ran inside and saw that an accident had just happened, and actually I was very surprised. Because since I got married, my husband has lived in the house nearby for 4 to 5 years, but there has never been an accident at this intersection. When I arrived, I saw the police sitting there asking about Mrs. 8's story, and then every day she used to sell lottery tickets right at this intersection, so she was the one who witnessed the first accident. First of all, it could only be Mrs. 8. When I heard people around, I knew it was this woman. While running at the intersection, the truck suddenly turned right, or was it the person? That woman couldn't brake in time, so she slid under the truck's chassis. From the abdomen down, the woman's stomach was completely crushed, only the neck up was intact. I felt so cold that I stopped asking and left. That day was very normal for her until the next morning, just around 5 or 6 a.m., when she heard banging, 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 banging sounds on the door. Hustle and bustle and screams. Listening carefully, she discovered that it was Mrs. 8's voice. She ran out to open the door and saw Mrs. 8 in a panic. Her hair was messy and her face was bloodless. As soon as she opened the door, Mrs. 8 jumped on her. She hugged and cried, but she didn't understand what was going on. She took Mrs. Tan inside the house and let her sit down. Calm down, then asked her to tell her what had happened. This 8-year-old lady just said to her, "I'm telling this story, but don't curse me." Then Mina said, "Oh, I know, but just tell me. Why did you suddenly feel like that so early in the morning?" Then yesterday when the accident happened at the intersection, Mrs. 8 was the first witness before the police or everyone else arrived. Then Mrs. 8 saw the woman from inside. Hey, there was a gold necklace thrown from the dead girl's neck. At this moment, Mrs. 8 became greedy. She quickly ran over to pick up this gold necklace and put it in her pocket. Then that same night, Mrs. 8 encountered an accident, while she was sleeping. Heard sounds like small drops of water click, 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 click. Only then did she realize that her face was wet, so Mrs. 8 lifted her hand to wipe it, and when she opened her eyes to look, she discovered that her hands were covered in blood and the fishy smell of blood, it streaked into her nose, making her very uncomfortable. When she opened her eyes to look up at the roof, she discovered that there was Nguyen's head, lying crookedly on the roof of her house. She immediately saw this severed part. Every drop of blood it fell drop by drop, and the eyes of that head were wide open staring at her 8. At this moment, she was very scared. She threw open the door to run away. Just as she was getting out of bed, she stepped on something very squishy, so she slipped and fell to the ground. Mrs. 8 falls down and lies down. When she lies down like that, her whole body is in pain, so she can't move. From the corner of the house, that person's head is there. It rolled, 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 rolled close to Mrs. 8's body. It's like a rolling ball. As soon as it rolled over, Mrs. 8 said, "Mrs. 8, why did you take my necklace? Can you give it back to me?" Why, when I heard Mrs. 8 tell the whole story, she also helped Mrs. 8 find the address of the house where she died in an accident. Finally found the address of that woman's bookmaker. Somewhere around 3 to 4 p.m., Mina also drove Mrs. 8 to the house of the person who had the accident. When Mina and her grandmother had just entered the house, a man about 40 years old ran out. That person looked at Mina and her grandmother, then opened his mouth and asked, "You guys are coming to return things to my wife, right?" At this moment, both Mrs. Tan and Mina had goosebumps. Then I asked that guy why he knew. Then he said, "My wife told me last night that there would be an older woman coming here to return the items." Hearing that, Mrs. 8 took out a necklace from her pocket and gave it to this man. She said, "This is your wife's thing, I'll keep it for you. Now I'll give it back to your wife." Mrs. 8 just grabbed Mina's hand and said, "Let's go home, go home." Mina also said, "Let's go inside, give someone an incense stick, then go home." But Mrs. 8 definitely refused, so I had to drive her home, thinking that if Mrs. 8 returned the necklace to that woman, everything would be over. But the story doesn't end there, everyone. The next morning, when Mina went to the market, right at the same intersection, Miss Tan was run over by a car and died on the spot. When Mina came to look at Mrs. 8's body, she saw a necklace on Mrs. 8's neck that was exactly the same as the necklace yesterday. Mina was very scared and she didn't know what was going on. The people around her joined with Mina to pool money to organize her funeral. 8. Because Mina lived close to home, she is the main person who put in the effort to take care of this funeral. On the evening of organizing the funeral for this 8-year-old woman, Mrs. 2 came to burn incense, and then talked to Mina. Mrs. 2 said, "I feel so bad for Mrs. 8, the morning of the other day. It just came to my place to buy some things, but the next day it was gone." Miss Vic just wondered why this woman is an expert in selling fake jewelry, so why did she come to her house? Meanwhile that morning, Mrs. 8 had just come to her sister's house to ask for help. Mrs. 2 just told me that Mrs. 8 came and showed her a necklace, then told her if there was a fake necklace exactly like this one, she would sell it to me. Only then did Mina understand that this 8-year-old woman went to buy another fake necklace to pay for the dead woman. I didn't expect that she was so cowardly and yet still greedy, wanting to keep that person's real gold necklace. Mina, I just thought that her death was probably the revenge of that woman, who was so greedy, and since that time, this intersection has had so many accidents that accidents have occurred. People here have to contribute money to build a temple right there. And this is the end of the story. Everyone who listens to the story finds it interesting. Please give me 1 like and 1 subscriber. I hope everyone has fun listening to the story. See you in the next videos. Goodbye.